Hello and welcome to the Practical Animal channel. The footage is of a hedgehog that has just moved in to the Practical Animal channel wildlife garden. I've begun tracking its movements. So far, I've found out it appears to sleep off the premises, but comes here to feed. It's very welcome. I've also been experimenting with a number of foods to find out its dietary preferences. It likes calciform worms and commercially available semi-moist hedgehog food, but not so much commercially available hedgehog meat. These dietary experiments are ongoing, though this does raise the issue of hedgehog nutrition, which I'm looking into. For my next interview, we go to Canada. My next guest has made a living as a fur trapper all his life. Ross Hinter is a provincial trapping instructor, and he trains other trapping instructors. He is coordinator for public and trapper education with the Alberta Trappers Association. The interview was about, amongst other things, the link between trapping and nature conservation. I began by asking Ross to describe his career. I hope you enjoy the interview. Thank you.
I've always been an adventurer. It's funny because my body seems to demand some kind of routine, but my spirit demands excitement and adventure. So I've always chased adventure. It won out in the end. I've always hunted and fished and been in the outdoors. I worked as a cowboy in the mountains of British Columbia for many years and raised my kids in that kind of an environment. And so we lived quite a bit of I thought it was great, but my kids realized very quickly that we lived an unusual life. And so they finally found out that not everybody's dad was the same as theirs. But having said that, because of the things that I did outside, trapping, it was only a matter of time that I would become and get involved in trapping. But being around animals and relying on them for a big portion of our food and stuff is where I got my start. So I was born and raised in British Columbia, the next province over, but my dad was born and raised here in Alberta. And so eventually I came to Alberta for my work, and then the trapping just took right off. That became the main thing that I did, and it's been the main thing for the last 35 years of my life. That's pretty much my whole life has revolved in and around wildlife management specifically, but trapping is always a part of that.
Ross, what skills, personal experiences, or qualities have been key to your success as a trapper?
I'm a provincial trapping instructor and I train instructors, and that's something we talk a lot about. It seems like people go through phases. We're all different in the way we view the world, but my view of it has I've always tried to look at things objectively and from a balanced perspective, at least to the level of my maturity at the time, or my ability to understand ecosystems and how they work. The skill to be able to understand habitat and what changes in an animal's environment is something that's extremely important if you're going to be effective, if you're trying to catch an animal. To be able to catch animals that other people can't catch, you need to understand their world, their habitat, and what they're dealing with at that time. So some animals are in an environment where habitat is multiple, that there's no problem. And other animals are they're struggling just to survive each day. So disease and starvation are two of nature's methods that very few people see, and they're extreme. When a fellow like me goes into, I need to know what's going on in that environment. And if they're in that type of a situation, that's going to effectively affect what I use and how I go about it when I'm catching.
Ross,
Okay.
what books or people or meetings have most influenced your thinking?
Well, the animals themselves have changed a lot of the way I think, and trying to study them and reading up on things. And just because something is in print doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate in all countries and in all environments. So being in the outdoors and being an influence, Morris Kohansky is an author and was one of the, I believe he passed away a couple of years ago, and we lost a great soul in that individual, that he inspired me to see much more in the bush than just the wildlife and how to be comfortable within that. And then being around other people who that are masters at dealing with wolves, when wolves are preying on it, livestock and things like that. Those are the types of people that have inspired me, because they're not just trappers that are just trying to kill things or to hang up the fur or whatever. They actually care about the animals that they're dealing with.
Ross, the officials who set the quotas for fur bearers, how do they decide whether or not an animal is endangered or not? Do they refer to the red data books, for example?
Provincially, there's federal laws and there's provincial laws in our country, but basically there's a reporting system. And so as an example, a licensed trapper in Alberta has to give a report of what he's taken and how many he's taken, how many were males, how many were females, and in some cases, juveniles. So when a person wants to become a trapper, we spend 3 days with them, teaching them how to do that type of thing. So they can't, as a trapper, they can't tell the actual age of an animal, but they can certainly tell a juvenile from an adult. And they can certainly tell a male from a female, obviously. When we teach them how to manage an area, whether that's their own land or whether an area that they've been entrusted to manage the wildlife, then you go through that with your record keeping, and you take a look, as an example, the marten. A marten is a member of the weasel family, and they're a really good example. So we take an overall look of how many of the harvest. So if a trapper took 10 marten, or he took 100 marten, depending on the size of his area, how many of those were juveniles and how many of them were adults? And so for a trapper, if he's trapping in the winter for the fur, and there's only about 2 months that he can do that, if he's taken too high of a percentage of adults, then that's a bad thing, and you don't want to do that. But if, say, 65% or higher are juveniles, he's doing an excellent job. I think that managing wildlife from a trapper's perspective is a lot easier than people realize. It's not you don't have to have a degree in biology to be able to do that. A lot of it's common sense.
Ross, how would you describe the trapper's year from season to season? Somebody was thinking about going into this, planning ahead. How does the year operate, the calendar?
So in October, some of us, even in late August, we start preparing our equipment, treating our equipment, fixing things that didn't get fixed last year, getting our equipment ready. As we move into October, late October, we're going to probably start putting bait out, getting the animals coming around and frequenting the areas where we're going to be working. And then usually by the beginning of November, we're starting to put our sets out. We have certain species that are not open until the 1st of December.
Ross, how would you describe the trapping industry today? What pressures is it under? Is it entirely possible for somebody to be a professional trapper in this day and age?
Yeah, it is. It really depends on, it's a controversial subject, and it's hard to just touch on and not explain it well. But in Canada, trapping is a management tool. Now, some individuals are just in it to make as much money as quickly as they can. And unfortunately, I'd rather not put my name with those individuals. But in this province, it is licensed. It's not licensed as a sport like hunting and fishing. It's licensed and regulated as an industry. It's Canada's oldest land-based industry, generally the fashion industry that utilizes the fur. And so I can't say that without following up with the fact that many people believe that trappers are trapping defenseless animals to make a bunch of money for rich people to wear coats. And that's just not the way it works. You don't get rich trapping. Without that market, then the animals still have to be trapped. I don't know any country in the world that doesn't trap. They may not be trapping for fur, but they're trapping, whether they're trapping mice or whether they're trapping whatever the animal is. Once they overpopulate and run out of habitat, something has to be done. And so because of that, and because we have to manage the wildlife, I hope and pray that there will be a market for the fur, because when there is no market, they're still going to have to be trapped, and then what? They're just discarded like a waste. And that's not the way to manage wildlife. And I made a living at it, both with the fur, taking people out and teaching them in the selling of the fur, and then wildlife control the rest of the year. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to make a living.
Ross, how do you see the fur trapping industry changing in Canada over the next 10 years?
Trapping is a prime example of what true conservation is. The North American Fur Auction, which is it's like a household name in the fur industry, has been around for well over 200 years, folded their doors and completely financially folded up, and they no longer exist. And it was an absolute shock to us. So people that I believe are truly involved in managing wildlife and need a market to be able to sell that fur, it's a tragedy. So I am a little nervous about the future. And as an individual, all I can do is things like this, where I get a chance to talk to people about what happens if we don't trap, and what happens if there is no market for that fur.
For people who are uninitiated and for whom being a trapper and a conservationist seems a contradiction in terms, how can you explain to somebody like that, look, trappers are conservationists? How so?
Good question. If I'm going to take the life of an animal, whether I've made that decision or whether the county or the province has made that decision, I better be good at it. None of us want to see an animal suffer. Canada has taken that very seriously, and in the research and technology for humane trapping, we have led the world in that, and we continue to do so. We have a very up-to-date facility where we test and research traps. There are 50 years ago. We have very strict guidelines. The greatest threat today to all wildlife, it's loss of habitat. It's huge. And if it's loss of habitat, where's it going? That's where we come in. When somebody's having trouble with an animal, they don't want anything bad to happen to that animal. And so they want me, say as a suggestion, they want me to live trap it and take it and release it somewhere. If you take, say, if the animal, say it's a beaver and it's causing problems. So there's very rarely only one beaver. They're a rodent. Very seldom are you just going to take one. But even if you just take that one, there is no suitable habitat where there isn't already beaver. And those beaver are not going to welcome that new beaver. They will attack it and kill it. The exception to that, and we've participated in that as an example, these last 2 years, we've live trapped fisher to be released in the state of Washington. That was a successful program because there is suitable habitat for them. Trappers play a key role in that they trap them at the right time of the year for the right reasons. They do it with equipment that must dispatch that animal within so many seconds. Restraining traps, and in Alberta, when you're trapping for fur on private land, it has to be checked every 24 hours. And very few people are connected enough with nature that they actually realize that wildlife has to be managed just like people. If you have too many people in an area and you don't have enough housing, you're going to have problems. The same thing with wildlife. Hiding from it just doesn't work. And when people blame logging and yet they buy toilet paper, they support the industry and then they blame them, or they buy paper, whatever. They don't remember that comes from the forest industry, or they blame oil and gas because in our province, oil and gas is a big thing, and they say they're wrecking habitat. But do they think about that when they start a quad to go out on the weekend or drive the minivan to go to the game or whatever? They don't seem to make the link that we're consumers and we're the biggest part of the problem.
What advice can you offer foreigners like me, fascinated by the trapping industry but living in Britain, or people in Canada wanting to take up professional trapping to earn a living? What advice can you offer?
But whatever a person's going to do, if they're going to be a professional at it, you need to go to the best, in my opinion. Anybody that's wanting to get involved in this, find out what's happening in your area and what you can do to get involved and educate people, help them to understand the effect that we're having on habitat, because that's the number one threat. Trapping is an important profession. It's not the end all be all of wildlife management, but it is an important concept. And as I mentioned before, every country in the world traps, but it may be called something different, but you have to manage when species overpopulate. And I feel that trapping will always be an important part of that, but learning to do it humanely with the best equipment available is the key.
Ross, is there anything you'd like to add?
I wish I could have more time with you. I'd love to be able to show you some of the equipment. I'm a very transparent person, so I raised 5 children, and we've had a lot of discussions on that. Now I have 10 grandchildren, and I want them to know what their grandpa does and why, and how we manage the animals. And instead of talking about when mice overpopulate, I like to be able to take people out in the bush and actually show them the signs of stress and distress from animals. They're in an area and they don't have enough to sustain themselves.
Ross, is there a particular book that you could recommend somebody reads as a test, as a primer, prior perhaps to doing a trapping course?
We spent a great deal of time over the years establishing our trapping manual, and it covers it's about $52 Canadian dollars to buy. It's not cheap, but it's an excellent manual. Management is management, and so if I could only recommend one, I would really say our Alberta Trapper Education Manual, in all honesty, is probably the best.
Ross, it's been an education. It's been fascinating, and you're inspirational. Ross Hinter, thank you for being on the Practical Animal Channel.
Thank you. It was great.
I would like to ask my subscribers if you want the interviews to be longer, because animal trapping is one of these subjects where there are often lengthy explanations involved in communicating about it. I had to edit a lot of this interview due to time constraints. As regards the impact of the video, the skills you need to be a trapper include the skill to understand habitat, ecosystems, and what changes in an animal's environment throughout the year. Animal environments are dynamic things, and a lot changes. The greatest threat to all animals is loss of habitat. There is, of course, an abundance of habitat for most animals in Canada, with the possible exception of beaver. The Alaska Trapper's Education Manual is probably the best text on the fur trapping industry in Canada. I asked questions about getting into trapping of Ross from the point of view of somebody willing to move to Canada. I just wanted to clarify that. The channel is for you if you want to know what it takes to work with animals. How I do this is every week I aim to interview an animal industry professional. I do this in a non-judgmental way. If the industry the person is in is legal, then I ask questions about it. If you've enjoyed today's interview, please click like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much.